And for those of you who might be meeting her for the first time, the sister got receipts, and we're going to spend some time so y'all understand it. She is a radio personality. She's produced and hosted shows for Radio 1, CBS Radio, SiriusXM, of course, and Voice of America. Best known for her work as host and executive producer of Coco Mode, a program she created in 2007 when she recognized the need for programming dedicated to exploring the role of women of color in areas of social justice, community building, and entrepreneurship. And of course, she is the daughter of the phenomenally, always amazing ancestor, the dynamic Joe Madison, and his beautiful wife, Miss Sherry. Thank you so much for being with us today, Shawna Renee. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Lurie, it's so good to officially meet you. I'm so glad to be here. I'm glad we were able to get this together. So thank you for having me. And thank you for those kind words. Ashe, ashe.
Listen, I want to thank you for helping us set off the Urban View morning so well. A lot of people were like, what's going to happen? We don't know what they're doing over there. And I feel like it has blossomed into this amazingly beautiful thing. And you being there on Mondays is just absolutely dynamic. So I'm just glad for this. Maybe one day we can meet in real life, in person. But yeah, this is good. This is good. So a lot of people don't know that you have an advocacy background in cannabis. And I didn't read any of that in your bio. So talk to us about your connection to the cannabis community and how you got started in your advocacy.
Sure. So I've been very quiet. I've been a very quiet advocate for, gosh, now it's going on about 10 years. Wow. It started around the time that I was diagnosed with breast cancer, late 2014, early 2015. And I had 3 partial lumpectomies, 3 separate surgeries. And after the second one, I was just tired of the pain medication. Now, prior to this, a lot of folks may not realize who are new to me, though, I also have 20 years in women's health, wellness advocacy. So I'm a certified yoga teacher. I ran a yoga studio. I'm a meditation teacher. I've studied Ayurveda. I'm a graduate of the Institute of Integrative Nutrition.
You speaking my language. You speaking my language.
So I ran a green juice company for years. So I'd done all of this stuff alongside of my media and broadcast work. But again, it was kind of done quietly, separately. Not for any specific reason, but that's just the way things were. So anyhow, when I was diagnosed back in 2014, 2015, I knew enough to know that I wanted to take sort of an integrated approach to the healing. And so after the second surgery, I realized that the pain medication that I was given was not working for me. The side effects were way too much. And I happened to belong to an online, this is when the Facebook groups were a really big deal. And I happened to belong to this breast cancer survivors group for Black women. And a woman from California in the chat contacted me and said, hey, you might want to consider a full spectrum cannabis product. It may actually help with some of your pain and you won't deal with any of those side effects. Well, at the time, that was nearly impossible for me to access. One, because I lived in Maryland and they had just come on board with medicinal cannabis at that point. And although DC had it, my job would not allow me to actually get a medical card or access it. And so I was able to do some things, work around some things.
We are creative as a people.
When necessary. And so I was able to get my hands on a tincture from a friend of mine who was in Michigan, which is where I'm from. And within days, the pain was gone, none of the side effects. And that was the moment that I said, okay, let me actually look into this. And so I started studying some of the research. There hadn't been a lot done at this point. There's not a lot now, but I started doing some research. And from then on, I mean, as they say, my nose was wide open. I was all in. So I joined Minorities for Medical Marijuana, the Advocacy Trade Group, the Minority Cannabis Business Association, and I started doing advocacy work on the medical side. And then later on, around 2020, I found myself in Illinois talking to some folks who said, there are no Black-owned cannabis dispensaries in Chicago. Wow. And there's only one on the South Side. So I was like, oh, here we go. Another access issue. There was an access issue for me 5 years ago. Now there's an access issue for folks in Illinois, which is a pretty liberal state as it relates to like, cannabis and things. And so I said, well, why don't we work to see if maybe we can open a dispensary? And it was prohibitively expensive, almost impossible, but we put together a lot of the paperwork and learned everything we could. So long story short, Maryland came on board. I decided to jump in, see if I could get a dispensary in Maryland. It did not happen, unfortunately, but the amount of information that I collected and the amount of research that I did, and then seeing firsthand, not only just with me, but then also seeing firsthand how this medicine was impacting folks who really needed relief, but did not want to rely on pharmaceuticals. That was it. So I'm in it. I'm in it to win it. And yeah, here we are.
The ability to get access, I think, is something that people don't necessarily appreciate, because when I've talked with some folks about cannabis legalization and expanding access, they say, well, you got the plug, they right down the corner. What you mean? But Shawna, Renee, you got a tincture. Right. And not everybody is looking for the product in the form that you're going to get it, if you're going to get it from the plug. But you having a tincture, having salves, having creams, having medicinal topicals. These are a variety of products that allow people to incorporate cannabis into their healing regimens in ways that, quite frankly, yeah, you could, but it's not the same, and it's not going to necessarily be as effective. And so the access point is really important, particularly when you think about the fact that there are still some states where people are serving time for cannabis possession and a host of other issues, while people outside of the prison walls are making business plans to exploit cannabis legalization and make money off of it. So there's still this, it's a discrepancy. There is a lot of racialized connotations to that discrepancy because of the way that the war on drugs played out. When it comes to our health, there are still so many places where someone is hearing this and thinking, I wish I lived in a state where I would be able to get access to that. I live in this country. I'm hearing them have this conversation, but the state I'm in will not allow me that access, and I physically need it for my body. When you first encountered cannabis as a part of your healing regimen, talk to us about what cultural beliefs you might have had to approach. Talk to us about the difficulties in procuring it, because I know for some people who got to be creative, these are considerations that they have to think about. There are some people who said, I know my aunt is suffering, but she believes cannabis is the devil's lettuce, right? So I know. So talk to us about some of the cultural shifts that we might need to make in order to expand the type of advocacy that we need to see in the cannabis world for us.
Sure. Well, the first thing I always encourage people to do is actually do some history, like look into the history of cannabis prohibition, right? It is rooted in racism. You cannot separate cannabis prohibition in the United States from racism. The man who was responsible for cannabis prohibition in the United States, his name was Henry Aslinger, was a vile racist. And cannabis prohibition was all about criminalizing, at the time, at the beginning of this process, criminalizing Mexicans who were coming into the country as refugees from the Mexican Revolution, and then also criminalizing Black folks in the South, particularly artists who were using it, because this was happening like between 1910 and 1930, right? So it was like the tail end of Reconstruction. Black folks are really just kind of starting to get their footing. So he saw this and realized this cannot be. And that was really the beginning of the war on drugs. People like to say it kind of started with the Nixon administration back in the late 60s and early 70s. No, it started in around the 1920s when this guy Anslinger was the head of, I think it was called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics at the time, which is sort of like the, early DEA. So when we realize the history of it, and we realize that this thing, prior to the prohibition at the beginning of the 19th century, cannabis was innocuous. Like you could get it at an apothecary, or you could get it at a pharmacy. It was in between the peppermint and the ginger, right? It was a medicine. We knew that it was a medicine. Right. And it had been known since, I think, like what was it, like maybe the early 1800s. A Scottish doctor brought it to the United States and started using it as a medicine to help women with menstrual cramps. For example, one of the queens of England was using it as a menstrual something to help with menstrual cramps. We knew that it helped with GI tract infections. It helped with pain. all kinds of things. So anyway, I say it's important to learn that history, because once you know the history, then maybe it can kind of help break through that stigma. You can understand that reefer madness and the war on drugs, and this is your brain on drugs and all these other things. This was propaganda. This was an intentional propaganda campaign to convince white Americans that cannabis was dangerous. And therefore, the people who used it, which were primarily Mexican immigrants and Black folks, artists, jazz musicians, right? We know Louis Armstrong said he didn't go a day without it, right? So to convince them that it was terrible, it was bad, and that the people who used it were criminals and needed to be controlled and put away. And it worked at this time because this was also sort of on the tail end of prohibition, alcohol prohibition, right? Which only lasted a few years. I mean, the country was going through sort of this morality thing. But they realized that as soon as they, made alcohol illegal, then what do we get? We got, organized crime. We got the mob. We got the mafia. So they said, okay, well, it's not as bad as we think. So again, when you learn the history and you know that the reason that you think it is the devil's lettuce, the reason you believe reefer will make you mad is because of a propaganda campaign that was designed to villainize Black and brown people. So as a Black and brown person with this knowledge, you can then step back and say, let me take another look at why I believe this to be true.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And that's huge. And I love the Sankofa approach to this, because we got to understand the history so that we can understand how we got to this space. Because as you well know, there are so many people who are physically suffering and who it's like you got a benefit sitting right over here, this little thing that can help you out. But because of the cultural, the perhaps even the religious resistance to it, people are literally blocking themselves from physical relief. And so I used to tell my son, it's all a plant. It's all spinach. It's like Popeye ate spinach to get strong. It's a plant. And the fact that we have created this sort of cultural rejection of it without knowing that history, I think is really important. So thank you for breaking that down for us. But let's say you're talking to someone right now who is in physical pain, who is trying to figure out what might help them. It comes in so many varieties, and maybe they have access to a dispensary. How do you know, without a medical doctor who might be certified in cannabis dispensation, or I don't even know what the proper terminology for that is, how do you know what type of product to use for the type of thing you're navigating? You mentioned some groups online. I don't know if that would be a source of information, but how do you determine, you got the plug, you got dispensaries with rows and rows and rows of products. How do you know what might work best for you if you don't have access to, say, Dr. Damas in Florida, who comes on the show every other week or so to help us talk about CBD? Like, what's the first step folks should be taking to research this?
So the first thing I think you should do is, if you are actually using it for medicinal purposes, and I want to be clear that there are people who use it for medicinal purposes and there are people who use it for recreational purposes, right?
And so
there's right. So there's and because it has a psychoactive effect, that and the psychoactive effect comes on quickly, and it's a bit different than being like intoxicated for alcohol. I like to acknowledge that is kind of why some people don't like it, right? Because they don't necessarily like being high. So the first thing I would do is say, if you happen to live in a state, and there are about 37 states now, right? So the exception would be in the Deep South. It's very hard to come by medicinal cannabis in the Deep South, but there are 37 of the 50 states right now, plus several territories in which medicinal cannabis is legal. You may need a medical card. So you probably will need to go to a medical professional, at least to access the card, and then therefore permission to go into a medical dispensary. When you go into the dispensary, the person working there should know how to help you. But let me just tell you this. If you are dealing with pain, for example, so cannabis has about 400 different properties. We don't know about most of them. I think we know maybe about a dozen, maybe 2 dozen. The reason is because it is federally illegal, there's not a lot of research being done. Most of the research that we have on cannabis came from a gentleman named Raphael Mechoulam, who was an Israeli researcher. So back in the 80s and 90s, he was able to isolate THC, and then we learned about THC and Delta 9 and Delta 8 and, CBD. So we know how some of it works. CBD is what you need for pain, right? So CBD is one of the properties. Now, if you really want to get in there, you need a CBD that has just a touch of THC. And that's why you need to go into a dispensary, because you can get your CBD creams from Vitamin Shop or whatever, but full spectrum is what you need, because this plant works together, right? All of these properties need to work together in order to be effective. So that's kind of where you start. Now, THC is used for, let's say, cancer patients who are having difficulty with an appetite. Sometimes it can be used for depression. So that is in at that point where you can maybe do some research. Their websites, Leafly, actually, Leafly was one of the first websites years ago that I looked into that broke down terpene profiles and the difference between CBD and THC. You can do some of that research on your own. But if that's not your wheelhouse, if that's not your ministry, then you absolutely need to go to someone who knows. And that's one of the things, like, I'm just starting a master's program at University of Maryland, and there are tons of them across the country in medicinal cannabis treatment and policy. So my goal is to become one of those people, that you can come to, one of those people who will train dispensary employees so you can comfortably walk into a place and say, my big toe hurts. What do you got for me? Or, I got cramps. Women especially, right now we're finding, I think Harvard just did a study that said over 80% of perimenopausal women now are using cannabis to try to treat their symptoms. I too.
Wait. Hold up now. Shauna, Renee, what you don't know is that I had my first hot flash about maybe 7 weeks ago on air. On air, sis. I was on air. I was fortunately streaming from home, and it was devastating. I thought I was dying in real time, but I had turned off my camera. I was like, I'm gonna die, and Amina ain't even gonna know I'm dying, because I just had to turn off the camera. I just laid out on the table and let the guests keep talking. It was what you mean? You could use cannabis to help with the symptoms?
Yes. Sis, I'm right there with you. I just turned 49 this weekend, past weekend.
Oh,
so
happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you. So I started during the pandemic. I started perimenopause at 45 during the pandemic. So, it was rough. So yes, it can be used. So this study that was conducted by Harvard School of Medicine, well, it was a survey. It wasn't a study. It was a survey. And they found that almost 90% of women that they surveyed used it to help with depression. They used it to help with anxiety, both which are symptoms of perimenopause, not ones that are often talked about.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yes. Anxiety, especially. Anxiety is a big one. Sleeplessness, insomnia, another big one. As you start to move into perimenopause, you will start to experience insomnia. And so a lot of women, almost all of the perimenopausal women that I know who are open to using cannabis therapy are using it for insomnia. So there's that. The other is, I know, I'm not even done yet, sis. The other,
I really need to study this more. I think I've been in rejection of the whole idea, so I'm avoiding it, because people be like naming symptoms. I'm like, that's why I can't sleep.
Yes, and pain. So let me tell you, during the pandemic, I had pain, child, from my scalp to my big toe. My whole entire body was hurting, joint pain. And I went to chiropractors and I went to acupuncturists. And it was actually my chiropractor who said to me, though I had already understood and knew the benefits of it, said to me, sis, ma'am, you need to go maybe look at some cannabis therapy. So yes. Wow. Now, hot flashes, there's not a lot we know about whether or not it would help hot flashes, because it doesn't really impact the hormones necessarily. It just impacts the way that your body is reacting to the hormone shifts. And so some people say they find some relief, others don't. But definitely pain, insomnia, depression, and to a lesser extent, anxiety, which are all symptoms of perimenopause. So I am a huge advocate for women moving into this space. In fact, the fastest growing demographic of people starting to use medicinal cannabis are people over 65. That's the fastest group. The older people dealing with what? Pain and insomnia. And then women over 40.
Wow. Okay. So I'm gonna have to I should not be willfully ignorant about this. I think I've just been in denial.
I
I'm just like,
know.
I know that thing had happened and it's happened a few times since, but I'm just gonna leave it over there.
I know.
I need to
I know.
embrace it full on. And this to me is one of the reasons why the Flower to the People segment is so important, because I feel like I'm constantly learning from people about more ways that this plant is able to help us. And as you mentioned, if it's got 400 properties and we know about less than 2 dozen of them, how many more benefits are out there that we should be exploring? So are you someone who makes your own products? I used to dabble with that a little bit, but not so much anymore. Do you make your own products, or are you more sourcing them from other people?
Well, in terms of cannabis products,
Mm-hmm.
no. So again, I am not a consumer. I do not consume at this point because of the work that I do. I'm
Mm,
not able to.
got you. Got you.
So I don't, but I actually think that it's important, if it's done well, that people rely on dispensaries when they can, because the thing about dispensaries is that they are required, the product that comes from growers and then the product that comes through the processing plants is required to go through rigorous testing. Now,
Mm,
listen, your plug is your plug is your plug. I have nothing against the legacy market. The legacy market is going to exist as long as people in the legal market are burdened by unfair tax
that's right.
issues, and the barrier to entry is so high and expensive. So the legacy market was going to continue. But if you do not know your person, like you don't know where they get it from, you don't know who's growing it, you don't know whose kitchen the edible is being made in,
Mm,
you probably would be better off trying to find a dispensary. So, if I were, I would probably either go with someone that I absolutely trusted, or I would just go ahead and go with a product that is made in like a processing plant.
yeah.
Um,
When
so
you said you don't know whose kitchen it's in, it occurred to me that perhaps we should take a who made the potato salad approach
yes.
to different things that you just getting out and about as you making your way to the market. You might, who made the potato salad? You might want to ask that question about these types of products as well. So what do you think is up next? Where's the next area of advocacy, as far as you can tell, from what your connection to the cannabis community is looking like? Where are you seeing some really right places that give you a little bit of optimism about the future of cannabis legalization?
So I think, cautiously optimistic. Everyone in the industry right now is cautiously optimistic because it's all very new. But obviously, President Biden's announcement that he was going to reschedule cannabis, so we would move from a Schedule 1 to, he's recommending a Schedule 3.
Mm,
There are some benefits to that. As someone who's on the medical side, I think the most important benefit is that it will then open researchers up to starting to study it so we can learn more about it and actually learn the benefits. And then also, if there's some things that we need to be careful about, cautious of, that'll give us an opportunity to do that. I believe that Vice President Harris recently talked about her position, because folks are wondering, as she is now moving into being the presumptive candidate, what her position is. And she has said flat out, times have changed. Marijuana should not be a crime. She's been looking at it from the restorative justice perspective, which
mm,
means that now is the time to really consider if we're going to start pardoning and expunging records and releasing people who are in jail on, non-violent, simple cannabis, possession or related charges. So there's a little bit of optimism in that space, the restorative justice space. Like maybe finally we can, get some of these folks out of jail. I'm excited about that. From a
mm.
business perspective, the rescheduling of it may also lift some of that tax burden. People who are currently in the legal business are beholden to something called 280E, which essentially means they cannot write off essential things that most businesses do. They're paying upwards, depending on the state, 70% tax rate,
Mm.
which is why hardly any businesses are profitable.
Right.
And as long as that's the case, look, the weed in the dispensaries is going to be expensive, and the legacy market is going to continue, and we're going to have a whole lot of unregulated, untested product out on the streets. And so when I say cautiously optimistic, I'm like, these changes, they're not enough. We actually wanted descheduling, but okay.
Right.
You know, here we are. So let's see how far we can get with that. And then we can start to put the pressure on the next administration to say, what's the next step? And so to hear Vice President Harris say, you know, we need to start regulating it and expunge convictions leads me to believe that even though she voted against it in the state of California back in 2010, she has a change of heart and realizes that, yes, we are now in 2024. 37 states legal medicinal, 25 legal adult use. Like that's half of the country, and 70%, over 70% of Americans want to see legalization in some form or fashion. So let's get her done. But for me personally, I'm interested in the work we can do around research for medicinal cannabis and access to people who need it. If you just want to go get high off after a hard, week on a Friday, whatever, that's fine. Do you? I'm not really concerned about that, but I want to make sure cancer patients, I want to make sure people dealing with, chronic pain, anxiety, depression. There's some research around sickle cell, folks who have seizures. Epilepsy. There's a lot of promising research being done now, and I want to see more of it being done.
I share that. I think that's absolutely necessary. I'm just so glad we got a chance to talk with you about this, hear your experiences, and it's important for people to recognize we all come to this space from a variety of ways. Some of us from an academic space, some of us from a personal space, some of us just stumbled into it. But the reality is we are here now, and we know that there is a lot of potential with this particular plant, and there's so much potential for the activism around it. And I'm just always grateful for the opportunity to bring great people on who can help us understand how full and robustly we can engage with both of those elements. Well, I don't know what's up next for you on next Monday with Shawna Renee on Urban View Mornings. Give us who you gonna have on, what we gonna be talking about, because y'all be killing it in the mornings. I love it.
I appreciate it. Well, listen, I'm not gonna say yet because we've got some requests out there. We haven't gotten any confirmations, but I think we're gonna talk to someone from the Department of Agriculture. There's been some interesting movement there as it relates to Black folks and subsidies.
Black farmers finally getting their due.
Yeah, so we may be talking about that. I know you all have been talking about it for the last couple of days. Former President Trump at the NABJ and all that meant. So, we'll touch on that. And as has been the case, listen, for the last few weeks, Sam and Daryl and I have put together an incredible show. And this Sunday night, somebody does something and blows the whole thing up. So I'm a little even hesitant to tell you what we're going to talk about. Who knows?
I can't tell you how many times I come in with a plan. It's like, okay, plan's gone. We're just start from scratch. We're just going to wing it because the plan is over.
Exactly. So, but we're getting closer to the, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, we're also getting closer to the convention. So we're going to also talk about what's going to happen, once we get to the Democratic National Convention.
What's the best way for people to follow you? Social media, website?
Okay, so there are a couple of ways. I announced this on Monday. I'm staying on X through the election, but then I'm jumping off. But if you want to find me on X, I am Shawna Renee, and then also Instagram, which is my preferred platform for now. And that is Shawna Renee _IG.